This is an ABC podcast.
And welcome, beloved listeners, to what I confidently predict will be a very, very special program. In my office at the farm, I've got all sorts of books with nice inscriptions by authors given to me before or after interviews, but there's a precious artefact as well, and I think it's probably symbolic of one of the most important friendships I've actually made on the program. The object is a little stone heart. You can put it in the palm of your hand. And it was given to me by the wonderful Gillian Mears, not only a great author, but an absolutely great human being. I interviewed her back in 2013 after she published her last novel, Foal's Bread, and again in 2015 when we spoke about all matter of things, including her writing and her illness. Author of 3 novels, The Mint Lawn, The Grass Sister and Foal's Bread, as well as many a short story, including the anthologies Ride a Cockhorse and Fine Flower. Now, I'm delighted that Gillian has found the perfect biographer in Bernadette Brennan. Bernadette is the sister of my favourite Jesuit Frank, who you might recall was immortalised by Paul Keating as that meddlesome priest. She's taken on the enormous task of sifting through the 154 boxes of material in the State Library of New South Wales, where Gillian had donated hundreds of diaries and manuscripts, photos, drawings, letters, and she's produced a wonderful biography. It's called Leaping into Waterfalls, The Enigmatic Gillian Mears, and it's published by Allen and Unwin. I have to welcome you to the program and thank you profoundly, Bernadette. You've done a wonderful job.
Well, it's lovely to be here. It's very moving to be here, given Gillian's beautiful interviews with you, Philip, over the years. And it's very interesting that you say I was the perfect biographer. A number of people have said that now, and it kind of felt like that. I didn't know it at the beginning, but it sort of felt like that as the process went on. So, we might talk about that, but it was certainly a huge project, a difficult project, and an immensely rewarding one.
I have to ask how it happened.
Well, I did get a little bit hooked on archives and biography when I worked on Helen Garner's archives in the National Library. And just that idea of struggling with a massive amount of material and weaving it all together to make some coherent sense of a life and writing was the trigger. I finished the Garner book and I just wanted to do it one more time. And my idea was, with the way Australian publishing and writing is, books fall out of print very quickly. Writers become forgotten very quickly. There's a huge generation of writers born in the 60s and early 70s who are great writers whose work is being left off print runs and they are being a little bit forgotten. And I thought, well, who was a really great writer from that time? And I came up with the idea of Gillian. I started rereading Gillian Mears.
Well, you make the point that her search to understand herself was one of the driving forces of her life, and she struggled with many of the big issues, I guess, of our time: sexual discrimination, environmental issues, gender, sexuality issues.
All of those things. And she was wrestling with all of them in her own head and then in her own writing, and living a fairly reclusive life, except when she was going out and having intense and often destructive romantic liaisons with different people, again trying to discover what it was about herself that was driving her desire and her needs. She dealt with all these sorts of things, and a number of people have said to me, but Gillian Mears, she had a fairly small life and she died at 51 and she lived in Grafton most of her life. And I'm saying Gillian Mears lived a big life, and it really was a big life, and it was a life of imagination and thinking, but also of action.
Well, Bernadette, she also had her eye on the future because she'd send stamped envelopes to friends asking for letters back for the archive.
Look, she was a bit of a shocker. She obviously had an eye for the future, and to amass that kind of material from the earliest of ages, she kept everything from about the age of 5, but to actually be archiving it from her early 20s and addressing her biographer in her diaries, dear biographer of the future, this is how I imagine you to be, and you're going to be me reincarnated, and all these sorts of things playing with the biographer's head really showed quite an extraordinary personality that was, in one sense, absolutely confident that someone would come along and write a biography. And in the other sense, what was she doing, putting all this stuff in there and just expecting someone to find it?
I think it's funny that 27 metres of material held in 154 boxes, second only to the Fairfax archive, but not just letters. We've got not just manuscripts, we've got photos, sound recordings, drawings, paintings.
It's an extraordinary archive. The diaries are the most extraordinary. That she would sometimes keep 3 a day, 30 pages a day or more, as well as all the other things she was writing. But at different times of her life, she put things in there as a way of drawing a line under her own experience. So, for example, she sold off all the family photo albums as a way of letting go, as she put it, in 1999 when she decided to sort of renounce her family, renounce everything and go and live on a farm outside of Nimboida. So there's photographs in there that one would say belong to the family, nieces and nephews, little kids building tents, having Moomin Troll evenings. But they're all in the State Library because Gillian had this idea that somehow she was going to create this entire life of herself in the archive.
Where does the title, and it's a particularly beautiful one, Leaping into Waterfalls, come from?
Well, in her second novel, The Grass Sister, there is a sister who goes missing in Africa, and she possibly, and I would say at the end of the book probably, does leap into a waterfall. So she was always interested in that kind of idea of negating the self and disappearing over the edge of intense experience. So she wrote that in the novel, but in one of her diaries, she wrote, now I understand, this was in the year 2000, so she is in the middle of, she's got MS very badly, but she hasn't necessarily been diagnosed with it yet. She's just before she's getting endocarditis and almost dying of heart disease. She's 37, and she writes in a diary, now I understand about the waterfall I kept on dreaming and even writing about. To not go over the terrifying maelstrom of change, to not let go and fall and alter and leave behind the safety of the little upper river shallows is ultimately courting death. So Gillian was a risk taker. She wanted
Absolutely.
She wanted to try everything and push the boundaries of everything. And this leaping into waterfalls idea was, if I keep myself safe, I haven't lived. So I just have to throw myself intensively into every experience I can come up with.
Bernadette, did her MS greatly intensify her sense of mortality? Did it add an intensity to her life?
It added an intensity, but in a strange way, I think, Philip. She was always obsessed with death from a young age, and when her best friend was shot at the age of, when Gillian was about to turn 16, shot by the best friend's mother, that kind of trauma exacerbated her nostalgia for childhood, but also her obsession that everyone she loved was going to die before she'd spent enough time with them. It wasn't necessarily her own death, but it was other people's deaths.
Yeah.
But then she's reaching towards her 30th birthday and things are going wrong in her body. And for the next 8 years, she doesn't have a definitive diagnosis of MS that I can tell. It's a bit questionable there that she may well have been told and repressed that. But she's trying to understand what's going on in her body, and she is extremely unwell and trying more and more extreme naturalistic and shamanic treatments for her body and getting very close to death through that decade of her 30s to her 40s. So I think it then intensified her sense that there could be an ending very soon for her. So yes, it did contribute, that intensity.
Yeah. So now the book is structured in 4 parts, each with 4 chapters. Are you into numerology?
No, but Gillian was. It's an interesting thing when you do a biography of, well, when I did this biography of Gillian, you spend a couple of years inside that person's head, so to speak, because you're immersed in their diaries, you're immersed in their letters, you're immersed in their life and their friends and lovers and family. And for me, at my age and the sort of person I am, I felt an obligation to honour and respect Gillian, to be honest in a biography, but to honour and respect her. And she had this quite deep belief in numbers, and 4x4 was her perfect combination and her favourite combination. So it just seemed logical to me. I thought just these small ways of honouring this writer who is no longer here. One small way is to say, I would structure this in 4 parts with 4 chapters. And that was a bit difficult. Some chapters are a bit longer than others, but it was really important to me just to think, I'm actually doing this in honour of your life and writing and beliefs. So that's why I did it.
Gillian was born to 2 parents that both had bad relationships with their own mothers. Do you think that made them overly determined to give their 4 girls a happy childhood?
I think so. I think the Mears girls had an idyllic childhood. They're raised in Gunnellabar outside of Lismore with Peter and Sheila, their parents, very much in love and very much devoted to these 4 girls who were all born within 5 years. And they lived this country childhood that most of us wouldn't get the chance to live, and most of us now would not even understand, I don't think. And it's a country childhood where Sheila gives them their love of books and language and classical music, and Peter gives them this absolute immersive experience in the landscape and outdoors and understanding the bush, and they thrive on it.
Bernadette, in a conversation I had with her off air, I remember she laughed at the fact that my name means lover of horses and I don't. But by God, she was horsey.
She was horsey. So Yvonne gets her onto a horse. Yvonne's the eldest sister. Yvonne was very horsey, still is. And Yvonne gets her onto a horse at the age of 10. And Gillian, being Gillian, is both terrified but exhilarated at the risk of getting on a horse when she can't ride, and takes off galloping after Yvonne because Yvonne was her hero. She'd do anything to keep up with Yvonne. And for the next 6 years, really, horses were everything. And then over the years after that, she still loved horses. She still had a horse. But then, of course, by the time she's in her 30s, it's increasingly difficult to ride a horse. But she's still in love with all the old horsemen and women of Kempsey and the Clarence Valley. So she lives for their stories and for hearing about horses and being around horses.
So, a seemingly happy childhood, lots of freedom and horse riding and camping and spending time in the bush. However, her relationship with her mother was problematic.
Look, I think it was, just going by what her sisters have told me and what her diaries tell me. Firstly, her adoration of her mother was extreme. I think all the Mears girls loved their mother. She was a very powerful force in their life, and she was a very powerful force as the central force of the family. She had a very tough life herself in England during and after the Second World War. And I think she lived a life where she loved Peter, her husband, and she loved her children, and she loved being in nature here in Australia, but she was terribly unfulfilled creatively, and she became increasingly frustrated and limited and angry.
Well, she expressed that frustration by taking lovers, one after the other.
Well, she did for a period in the 70s when the girls were at that sort of formative age of Gillian was nearly 14. She also expressed that anger by smashing plates. And, you know, I now kind of hold my hand up to her and say, go, Sheila, that's a great way to go. But I imagine for a teenager, a woman who's got a wall built in her new house where she can smash plates and says to people, look, don't worry about it. I'm just going to smash for a while and then I'll be right.
Well, like Gillian, she was a risk taker. She even follows a lover to Russia.
She did, but came back to Peter and her girls and lived very happily with them once she returned. So that was just a period of her life. But I think going from what Gillian wrote and publicly and privately, it was a very traumatic and formative experience for Gillian, that sense of abandonment and anxiety about mothers and desires and women and fulfillment.
Her relationship with her sisters remained intense her whole life, and there were many periods that none of them were speaking to each other.
Yes. Look, it's they've had a lot of trauma in this beautiful family that love each other desperately. They have had a lot of trauma, and they continue to still be negotiating that kind of trauma. And you might not know, Philip, but Gillian's beautiful younger sister, Sonia, suddenly died on the 29th of May this year. She had a pulmonary embolism and died. And so there's trauma that still hasn't been resolved in the family. And now they've lost two of their beautiful sisters, and Peter's lost two daughters in a space of 5 years.
So their relationships were, in a sense, too intense.
Too intense. They all told me separately, each of them used the word enmeshed and said we were enmeshed. And then I think things went wrong. There were certain betrayals which are not really mine to tell, and they haven't been resolved. And therefore, I think maybe the intensity of that beautiful, isolated childhood where they were each other's soulmates has maybe contributed to a breaking apart, which is a very sad story.
I loved her restlessness and her attitude to time, even in adolescence, unable to enjoy the moment because she was worrying that it was disappearing too fast.
Now, isn't that extraordinary? And there must be some listeners who respond to that and think like that. And I think it's really important for understanding the sort of person she was, because how can you be having this lovely childhood, everything's all wonderful, and yet you're constantly thinking, I'm anxious, I've got this knot in my belly because this is going to end.
Well,
and
one of the factors here, of course, was the death of her friend Sandra.
Enormous. And how do you deal with that? And of course, there's no grief counselling for her at the time. So she's shattered and just somehow has to get on with life and go back to school and function somehow.
I don't want to be voyeuristic, but we should tell the listener that Sandra was murdered by her mother.
Yes, and Sandra was Gillian's best friend, and her parents trained racehorses. And the girls, lived this life of, again, intense freedom and joy, and they would be at school together, and then they would ride their horses, they'd swim in the Clarence River, ride their horses wildly around the place, chatting to the old men and hearing their stories. Gillian was actually at Sandra's house the day that she was murdered, and she left early. It was Sandra's birthday, I think it was, or her mother's birthday. There was a cake they made, and Gillian was going to stay overnight, and she didn't. She left early. And the next day at school, she hears a whisper that Sandra's not at school because Sandra's mother had shot Sandra, her younger brother Johnny, who suffered from Down syndrome, and herself, the mother, had shot herself. And Joy, the mother, and Johnny died instantly, and Sandra survived for almost a day and then died. So she's got to deal with that somehow, with no counselling, no help, nothing. And she's a sensitive kid. She's a sensitive, porous kind of kid, open to the world.
Little wonder that a darkness came over her and she leaves Grafton for Sydney. And after school, studied creative writing. And from the beginning, people saw that you had talent, particularly for short stories. And you reveal, and I didn't know this story, she sent one to Bruce Pascoe, who was then editor of Australian Short Stories, and he published it.
He did. The Midnight Shift. And it's an extraordinary publication trajectory that most writers these days would be envious of and horrified about, I think. This kid, she's a kid at university, she sends off this story to two different journals. Both of them say, oh, we want this. Both of them say, well, we're going to publish it. There's a mix-up of not knowing one is going to publish it and the other, so we'll leave that aside. Bruce Pascoe, when he finds out that it's going to be published in Hecate, says, doesn't matter, it's so good, we need to publish this story. And on the strength of that then says, look, by the way, have you got any more? Because we'll publish a collection. So here's this unknown 20-year-old who's being feted by a publisher who says, look, we'll publish anything you've got. And then shortly after, she gets a letter from Darcy Randall at UQP saying, listen, on the strength of that story, we'll publish anything you've got.
Wow.
So she starts from this level of anything she writes, everyone's just going, yep, we'll publish that. Yep, we'll publish that. And then, of course, it goes on to win the prize for the Commonwealth Writers' Prize for the first book.
I can't help but contrast this with the early efforts of Peter Carey. No one would publish Carey. And I literally bullied Overland into publishing one of Peter's first stories. They did it as a favour. She didn't need those sort of favours. People wanted her stuff.
Now, that's really interesting. They did, because that would have been the early 70s with Peter Carey. You would have been trying to get that published, yes, probably about then, I'd say. So Gillian's having this published in the late 70s, 79, 78. They're just saying, yep, we want to publish everything you've got. So she really did have this talent. It really was shining from the first instance, and she never looked back. Everything she wrote was an award winner. Everything she touched.
Now, let's get a bit
end.
voyeuristic here, because Gillian had a sort of an erotic field around her. On the one hand, she was shy, didn't say much, but this intensity she had was revealed in her love affairs and relationships.
I loved the interview with you. I think it was the 2013 one. And you actually said to her, well, Gillian, you've had lots of lovers or something like that. And she said, no, I haven't. I've really been quite moderate. It was a great moment when she responded to you like that. But yes, she did have a number of lovers. She was intense. Anyone who met her almost instantly fell in love with her. It was this magnetic openness, but the sparkling eyes, the voice, the smile, the willingness to be there one-on-one with that person.
Well, one of them was her English teacher from Grafton, 11 years her senior. But you make the point that she had passionate affairs with men and women, often more than one at a time.
Yes. Gillian she desired people. She fell in love with people. It was, for her, most of the time, it wasn't a matter of gender or sexuality. It was, I love this person. And usually it was a teacher or someone that could teach her something about herself that was wiser in some form of knowledge that she wanted to know. So there would be the sort of the eros, if you like, of the intellectual connection. And from there, it became a very physical connection.
You believe that she was, in a sense, deeply insecure, so needed someone to be the rock and create some structure.
Yes, but this is one of the great contradictions of Gillian's life, that she was intensely needy for validation. She was extremely vulnerable. And yet she was so strong in herself. So she had this intense core of self-belief at the same time as needing almost continuous affirmation from others.
It's always dangerous to be friends with a writer, let alone lovers of a writer, because you tend to turn up in the book. And many of her friends and families and lovers were shocked to find themselves in the writing, often very thinly camouflaged.
Very thinly camouflaged. It's kind of devastating to read once you actually know the story of her life. So that I read Gillian Mears's work not knowing anything much about her life. And once I then have done this research and read her letters and diaries and I know what happened, to go back and reread the novels actually blows my mind. But actually what it does is it makes me even more impressed with the art, because thinly veiled is a polite way of saying it. Sometimes I'm thinking that's exactly the conversation that was had. That's exactly the situation that was had. They are exactly the names of the people that were your grandparents or the people you're talking about. And yet she somehow managed to turn that into a novel that speaks to other people who know nothing about her life. That's a real talent. That's something which says, this happened to me, and I'm going to turn this into a story that has a deeper resonance and a more expansive resonance to all of you readers out there who basically live in families, have relationships, are intense, are nervous, are worried, are unfulfilled. That's what she manages to do.
What happened when you approached these people to talk to them about your book?
Well, for most of her lovers, there was deep anxiety. And the anxiety was twofold, and it was different in different people. On one level, there was an anxiety. Some people wanted to protect Gillian's privacy and hadn't realised that she had put absolutely everything in the archive. And so at first they said, well, we don't really want to talk about that, which of course I respected. But then they came around later on and said, oh, okay, well then, yes, come and talk to me. And then, in fact, for those people, they then said, oh, here's all the letters she gave me, and here's all the love letters, and here's the diaries from the time. So that was fascinating. The other reason they were a bit anxious, a couple of them, were thrown back into the intensity of their relationship with Gillian. And that was really interesting because some of these relationships are decades old, and yet the lovers were thrown back into how intense and powerful the relationship was. And that just says something about Gillian's impression and power and effect on people.
Because Gillian died so young, of course, many of her contemporaries are still alive. But do you think that she wrote about her friends and family so obviously, so candidly, because in a sense she might have lacked empathy?
That is easily arguable. Yes, I think. Well, again, like everything with Gillian Mears, the answer is yes, but, or well, yes, but. Did she lack empathy? In one sense, there was a certain blindness to what her words might do to other people's lives. It was, well, I'm creating art, and why would I even think of you? On the other hand, she was a deeply empathic person, open to the energies of the world in a way that were almost dangerous for her. Ramona Koval and Susan Hampton and Drusilla Majeska, in different interviews, used almost identical language to talk about Gillian and said to me, she was skinless. She had no barrier between herself and the world. She felt everything. So she was intensely empathic, and yet she could be absolutely blind to the feelings of others when it came to her art.
I'm talking to one of my favourite Brennans, Bernadette, about her book on the enigmatic Gillian Mears called Leaping into Waterfalls. Now, she shares this willingness to expose friends with the aforementioned Helen Garner. Do you see similarities? Because I hadn't realised they were both friends.
They became, yes, very interesting friends. The similarities are funny. There was a time early on in my research with Gillian when I sent Helen a text and said, gee, Gillian Mears makes your boundaries look positively rigid. And Helen Garner laughed. She thought that was, whoa, whoa, whoa. So there are very similar, there are resonances between them, if you like, as writers and as the way their lives inflected their work and how they had all sorts of boundaries that were broken. Gillian seemed a lot more prepared to put everything in, whereas Garner actually held back quite a bit, believe it or not.
Bernadette, who were Gillian's influences? Who were the writers she admired?
She was obsessed with Carson McCullers.
A good choice.
A good choice. And you can see in McCullers' work how it would have resonated with the troubled Gillian trying to understand herself from that early age of 13, 14, 15 when she began to read McCullers' work. She was absolutely enamoured of Marilyn Robinson's work, particularly Housekeeping. She read that book every year of her life. Australian writers, she read Drusilla Majeska, Helen Garner, Kate Grenville, but Gerald Murnane was an intense influence in her life and her writing. And she actually credited with Manane, she said, with teaching her how to see colours. So she felt that his writing taught her an imaginative perspective that she had never understood before. And she basically strove to write everything to impress him.
Drusilla, of course, said that they were both writers whose personal and fictional worlds meld. Now, she's only in her 30s when her body starts to show signs of MS, but despite the family history of MS, it can take a long time to get a formal diagnosis. And in the meantime, she tries alternative remedies and moves in with a man claiming to be a healer.
Yes, and I mean, in one sense, Jeff Nanto, as he now calls himself. He is and was a healer in that he was a trained shiatsu specialist, and he was living a life of great removal from the noise of the world and living a very strict macrobiotic life, diet, and practicing meditation and being at peace, if you like, and away from the noise. Now, that came at a time for Gillian that was spot on. She was feeling stuck. She'd moved back to the family home. She was not well. She couldn't walk. She didn't believe that her family gave her enough sympathy for her symptoms. And she was feeling that she was stuck. She really couldn't write at that point, and she had too many people around her. And along comes this man. She'd been very much in love with a woman a few years earlier, and they'd had a very sad breakup in 1997. And it was the first time Gillian's heart was really broken. It was the first time she was left by a lover rather than the other way around. And she vowed to herself that she would not have any relationships for 2 years. And of course, right on the 2-year point, when she's actually getting a bit antsy and looking around and asking all sorts of people if they'd like to be in a relationship, Jeff turns up at the environment centre where she's working, and here he is, this very gentle, quiet shiatsu specialist who is living a very healthy lifestyle. So she is immediately attracted to him and moves out to Nimboida, to his farm, and she lives out there with him for a couple of years from then on.
It's interesting that she believed her health issues were caused by emotional trauma from broken relationships.
Yes, she kept a book of the body for most of her adult life, and she also recorded things in her diaries. And all the way through, when she would be recording the physical and factual things that were going on with her body, as in, I had an X-ray of this or an MRI said that, she would also say, had a breakup with X, or I fought with Yvonne, or this happened. So the emotional aspects of her life and what went on were as equally important, or perhaps more so, to her than anything else that medicine had told her about her body. And she came to believe that, well, it's worth actually knowing this. So she did have a lot of these symptoms, and she did actually go to 2 different neurologists and then some different surgeons. And all of them said, your problems are coming from your cervical spine, where you have a bone spur, where you probably have an old fracture from falling from a horse. And what we need to do is a very radical and difficult and painful cervical surgery, which will see you in a neck brace, and we're going to drill through your vertebra. Now, obviously that wasn't what was wrong with her. She had MS, and luckily she got to the point...
As her mother's father.
As her mother's father. But when she got to the point of meeting a woman who'd had the same surgery who was in terrible pain, that was the defining moment when she thought, I'm done with Western medicine. I will not put my body through this anymore. And she threw out all the scans. She buried them in a pumpkin patch. And that's the moment that Jeff turned up, and she decided, I'm going to go the natural healing way. Now, yes, her mother's father had MS. His name was Bernard, and they called him Barney. And he died at the age of 50 with no legs, having been amputated to make it possible to care for him, and he was blind. So on one hand, Gillian did not know that she had MS until 2002, when she was diagnosed definitively. On the other hand, many years earlier, she had gone to a neurologist at St Vincent's Hospital, and she writes in her diary, I really want some answers about these symptoms, and I'm in the neurologist's waiting room. And then for the first time in all these years, the diary is cut and there's about 4 pages that have been excised very carefully. And then the next entry is August 6th, oh, I'm home early. So that's fascinating to me, I think, what was in those 4 pages that you've taken out, always with an eye to the future.
Well, let's look at what else was happening with her writing. While her health deteriorates, she abandons a novel she's begun, returns to short stories and essays, and published her book of short stories, A Map of the Gardens.
Now, that is a radical departure from much of Mears's writing. And some writers and some readers will tell you that's their favourite Mears book. It was less focused on immediate family. It was very much focused on her health, on her macrobiotic diet and her lifestyle out at Applebox Farm, which is at Nimboida, where she's living with Jeff. So it's a collection of stories which really get into the darkness of a relationship, which is a tortured kind of relationship, a codependent relationship, but also stories about health and learning to surrender your ego and perhaps leaving the garden of safety, perhaps going over the waterfall, perhaps courting death, but it being a worthwhile journey. And that's what she writes at that time.
Talking about courting death, she's near death before she's taken to the hospital where her body was shutting down and she was in heart failure.
She was so ill. It was the night before her 38th birthday. She had had endocarditis, which she had got in February. Now we're now talking July. Normally, with the bacterial endocarditis she got, a patient will often die with that endocarditis without it ever being diagnosed because it presents in such a difficult way. So in 1 week, she lost 10 kilograms. She had terrible, terrible pain. She was vomiting. She had diarrhea. She was very ill. So it looked like a standard or very severe gastrointestinal problem. She managed to survive that without any medical intervention. And then she managed to survive for the next 4 or so months as she got more ill. And yet she was judging short stories. She occasionally talked to people who came to visit. She was crawling around on her hands and knees because she couldn't walk. She had calluses forming on her hands and elbows and knees. But she just kept on going, saying, well, obviously I'm in so much pain and these night sweats and these hallucinations, but it must be because my body's finally losing all the toxins of the caffeine and sugar that I've been addicted to all my adult life. And she believed that. And it got to the point where she was 39 kilos. She was in heart failure. She had a massive 40-centimetre growth on her mitral valve. Her liver and spleen were shutting down. And she very quietly said to Jeff, could I light the fire? And suddenly he realised how incredibly ill she was and took her to Grafton Hospital. Now they said, well, look, she's probably not going to last the night. But they gave her a transfusion and then they started some intravenous antibiotics, and then they flew her to Prince of Wales and she needed open heart surgery to replace her mitral valve. She's 38 at this point. Lordy!
And she gets to 40 and finally she's diagnosed and realises or takes the view she has to look after herself instead of relying on others.
Yes, it's a absolutely essential change in her life. She reaches her 40th birthday and finally, in my mind, this sensitive young girl who's grown into this troubled but sensitive woman who has relied on others to give her some kind of structure and keep her safe, finally understands herself enough at the age of 40. And in true Gillian style, rather than saying, okay, I'm going to stand on my own 2 feet, we've got to do this in an excessive way, she buys the converted old 1970s ambulance and takes off by herself into the bush to drive across Australia in pursuit of another healer who is going to supposedly teach her a specific form of yoga that will help her. But that healer is in Adelaide. So Gillian with MS takes off in this old 2-ton ambulance with no plan, just says, I'm going to drive and I'm going to find my feet and dance in the desert by myself. and off she goes.
And she writes about this period in her memoir, Life in Ant and Bee, which is the name of the converted ambulance. I was absolutely shocked to realise how little she was living on. At this point, she had a disability pension and very little else.
That's right. So when she was living at Nimboida, she had an income of about $1,500 a year. She didn't take any money from Jeff. They grew their own food. They made their own food, but she was just so intensely poor. And I think that's a really important thing to remember, that not only as a writer is she so poor, even though she's won all these different awards and got these different grants, it's living with a disability also is extremely expensive. And she has no savings. So at this point, she's nearly 40 and she heads off in Ant and Bee, and she earns that year $2,500 in royalties from her work. So she relies on writing the short stories and sending them to magazines like Heat, and Ivor Indyk is the editor there, who pays her quickly. She relies on that kind of turnover of money to eat.
And did this influence her decision to sell her papers to the State Library?
Definitely, yes. So at different times, she came up with different plans of how she could make some money. And she was starting to think by about 2007, maybe I shouldn't keep selling my papers to the State Library, because maybe I'm getting a little bit embarrassed now about what this reader of the future is going to find. But she's absolutely broke. And so she says, I'm going to come up with this idea of an Ant and Bee trust. And so she writes to a few people that she thinks will be interested who have a bit of money and says, will you just basically sponsor me? And they all say no. So she says, oh, okay, well, I'll just send a whole lot more papers to the State Library and make some more money out of that. So that's actually how she survived, by selling the 8 different tranches of paper to the State Library.
Well, she had a complicated relationship with death because, as we've discussed, she was willing to try anything to stop it. But at the same time, she welcomed it.
She did. I think what she welcomed was a release from pain. And she was very close to a man by the name of the Reverend Peter Catt, who was the head of the Anglican Cathedral in Grafton for a while in 2000s. And he has a doctorate in evolutionary microbiology and he has a Bachelor of Divinity. So he's a smart, thinking, open, sensitive man. And Gillian became mates with Peter Catt, and she didn't believe in God of any sort. She had this idea of the God of lost things, whatever that meant. But God was someone who was in a bird or was in a beautiful sunset or was something larger and beautiful in the world. So she used to talk to Peter Catt about ideas and philosophy. And he said to me, she was so wise. She knew things that none of us had worked out, and she would think about them deeply, and then she would say something to me and say, oh, but I don't know. And he said, I did think at one stage, if Gillian doesn't know, then none of us have got a hope about this.
Before we have to take our leave, did she manage to make peace with her sisters?
She did. She was close to all 3 of them in 3 different ways, 3 different kinds of relationships. So she was very close to Yvonne, and they were going to breed horses together and make them available to kids who couldn't afford to own a horse but would love to have horses in their lives. She was very close to Sonia and her children. She loved Sonia, and Sonia lived close by, and they saw quite a bit of each other, and Sonia used to take her to the water whenever she could. She loved Karen. Karen had moved away the year before she died, but they were in very close contact and they had a lot to do with each other. So she was absolutely at peace with her sisters individually, but what she craved was for them to be at peace with each other. And she did reach a point near her death, and I don't know if her thinking had become too rigid because of the MS, but she reached a point just before her death where she had an idea that if she died at this point, she would solve the problems in her family because her sisters would come together over her dead body and they would be reconciled. And that didn't happen, unfortunately.
Bernadette, how did your feelings or your views about Gillian change?
I started the project with no particular views or feelings, except possibly a feeling of admiration for her writing and for the gutsiness of that essay, Alive in Anton B, and that experience she had. Over the years, there were times when the material that I was reading was very dark and sometimes got quite narcissistic in my opinion. And there were times when I needed a break and I needed to get away, and I thought, I don't think I can do this. But I would always come back. And so my feeling really is that I wish I had known Gillian better when she was alive. I wish I could talk to her now. I respect her. I wish she had got perhaps more help with her emotions and feelings than she did. And I have a real fondness for her. I really admire her and respect her, and I would have liked to have been her friend, but at a distance. I wouldn't want to have been too close.
Well, now, in a sense, you are her friend at a distance as her biographer, and thank you for that.
Thank you, Philip. It's been lovely to talk.
Bernadette Brennan, author of Leaping into Waterfalls, the enigmatic Gillian Mears, published by Allen and Unwin. I think before we go, we should hear from Gillian herself, from a conversation we had in 2015 when her beautiful book, The Cat with the Coloured Tail, came out. It was the last book she published and was inspired by her adventures in that converted ambulance that she called Ant and Bee. I want you to tell us a fable about an ice cream salesman, Mr. Hooper, who was taught small acts of kindness by his cat.
Yes, well, these two characters, the cat with the coloured tail, and Mr. Hooper, they came about, of all places, in the South Australian Mallee, where I was camped. And I know you'll probably think this sounds like a segment of New Age nonsense, but there was a lunar eclipse.
You turn New Age nonsense into something quite magical, so I suspend all my cynicism.
Well, I knew I wanted to write a book that was more in line with what Paul Gallico used to write.
Your cat that died was called Paul Gallico.
That's
I remember
true.
that.
You are correct. And Paul Gallico owned 23 cats when he wrote his famous book, The Snow Goose. He lived in a lighthouse with 23 cats. So I wanted to align myself with a different kind of writing from what I've written previously, which, although it has found its readership, I wanted to write something more to do with those books of childhood that you just leafed through as a child and with excitement grabbed them from the shelf of the library. And I wanted to enter into that hallowed realm with my book.
So while this is in effect a children's fable, like all the best children's books, it's equally valid for grown-ups or people who think of themselves as grown-up.
Yes, I feel it is. And I don't know if you've read the last lines of my acknowledgement. Okay, I really do believe that the coloured pencils of the world hold a place. They hold a place for changing the diabolical things happening on Earth at the moment.
Well, you talk in the book about the heart of the world being in danger.
I feel when you look at what is going on, even as we speak, in every direction, is horror. And I would like to take my coloured pencils into the world of the Taliban and say, let's proffer these to the girl suicide bombers in Nigeria. Instead of bombs and grenades, let's give them coloured pencils and remind those Islamic extremists that Muhammad, now I only found this out recently, he had a very precious cat called Mueza, who he loved so much. She was a female cat that when the call to prayer came out and she was asleep on his robe, he got out a pair of scissors and cut off the sleeve of his robe so that he didn't disturb his cat. Now, I didn't know that until recently. I feel it holds some hope, Philip, for stopping this war, this eternal 1,000-year-old war between the Islamic world and the Christian world.
And that was Gillian Mears from the last time she came on the program back in 2015. In a way, I'm glad she didn't live to see the Taliban take control again in Afghanistan, because we all need more coloured pencils in our lives. And that's your lot for the week. Thanks to the team, EP Anna Whitfeld, Anne Arnold, Jackie Dent, Ian Coombe, Julie Street, and sound engineer this week, Tim Jenkins. See you next week.
You've been listening to an ABC podcast. Discover more great ABC podcasts, live radio and exclusives on the ABC Listen app.